you're ready.
Okay, it's great to see everyone in a virtual way this evening. It's a bit of a weird thing. It feels a bit like teaching two seminars, doing the same talk twice in a day. And I said earlier, I don't know if this will be more polished or just more tired, because I've also worked a shift in our local museum in between. So it's been a long day. I've done a lot of talking, and I'm hoping my voice will hold out. So to introduce myself quickly first, I'm Steve, Dr. Stephen Curtis. I'm at the University of Lancashire, as it says on the slide, which most of you will know as the University of Central Lancashire, but we're changing our name. So I'm trialing the new name just to try and hope to raise some awareness. I don't know why it's happening. It's politics. It's complicated. It's above my pay grade. It just is a thing. And the title, The Stephen King Swedish Horror, A Brief Introduction to John Lindqvist. As I said this morning, we'll say again, I'm not a Swedish speaker. I wish I could read the original language. I can't. And I apologize for my pronunciation if anyone is a Swedish speaker, but I will try to use the original titles of the novels as well as the translated ones, just because I think that's kind of important to give it an idea that these are originally in Swedish. So I use the title Stephen King here, partly tongue-in-cheek, but also partly because I think it's a really appropriate lens through which to think about Lindqvist's work. The idea of being the new Stephen King has happened to every horror writer who's broken through since the 1980s. Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, Adam Neville, everyone is the new Stephen King, because nothing else exists in horror. As a Shakespearean by trade, it's the same situation I have in that field, where people only know this style of writing through one individual, which is fine in terms of raising awareness, but it does often feel like it's very limited. The same with if you go into a bookshop and look at the horror section, it will mostly be Stephen King books now, even if you want to read them or not, and then a few other examples. So it is kind of a limiting way of looking at text, but actually it also does work for Lindqvist because he has a very similar mentality when it comes to kind of small town horror. It's not massive horror on a cosmic scale. It's usually very small human communities, and it's about the way in which they deal with horror, and the horror often comes from within those communities, much like a lot of Stephen King's greatest work. And there is a lot of parallels you can draw. I allude to them a couple of times, but it's not really a kind of Kingian reading, particularly with the likes of Stephen King's It. And we'll see some talk of that with the newest book later. Although, as I will always say, Lindqvist is better at writing endings than Stephen King. Oh, we have a cat in the window. That's going to distract me. I'm going to look at the other screen. Yeah, but we'll talk about that more when it comes to the most recent book. So I will start, as we always should start, in a way that I will not look at Sam's eyes rolling again, with some Derrida. This is not a theory-heavy talk. Don't worry, it's not one of those sort of ones. But I think this particular quote from Derrida's Of Hospitality is really useful in kind of centering my talk around these books and their focus on the kind of ethics of hospitality and the way in which allowing somebody in, obviously the first book being called Let the Right One In, is central to Lindqvist's particular appeal, particular look at horror, but also speaks to us on a wider level about why horror can not just terrify us, but hopefully also open our eyes to horrors that are happening in real life, and think about ways in which we could, if we can, not necessarily change ourselves if it's kind of policy stuff, but we can at least be aware of them and hopefully try to push for something that's more positive. So Derrida says in Of Hospitality, in part of a conversation where he's talking about conditional hospitality and unconditional hospitality. So conditional hospitality is the kind of hostile environment that the Tories definitely really focused on. Labour seem to be continuing, and we're seeing an absolute extreme in America, but has also been happening in Swedish culture, probably most relevantly to this talk. But in terms of unconditional hospitality, Derrida says, let us say yes to who or what turns up, before any determination, before any anticipation, before any identification. Whether or not it has to do with a foreigner, an immigrant, an invited guest, or unexpected visitor. Whether or not the new arrivals is a citizen of another country, a human, animal, or divine creature, a living or dead thing, male or female. And Derrida wasn't writing about Lindqvist, but most of this taxonomy can be read in Lindqvist's work. But the thing to think about is this idea of hospitality being a basic human quality. To be able to avail yourself of hospitality should be a basic human right. And that is something that seems really caught up in what Lindqvist is talking about. So from the very first book being called Let the Right One In, all the way through to the most recent book in English, The Kindness, there is a thread throughout of a notion of monstrosity and horror being something that occurs when hospitality breaks down or is being misused or misappropriated for some reason. So we'll return to that at the end as a kind of to bookmark things, but it's not, Derrida's not here. Derrida is welcome, but he's not the main focus of today. So to give us a bit of context first of the kind of wider origin, Sam mentioned in the introduction about the Nordic noir. In the early 2000s, which is not that long ago, but my students, well, both my children who are teenagers, it feels like another century ago to many of them, there was this massive kind of wave of exposure of Scandinavian culture in a wider English and American context. So the likes of the Stieg Larsson Millennium trilogy, although there are more books in that series, Joe Nesbo's crime, but often with a kind of a, if not supernatural, then certainly kind of dark horror crime aspect. TV shows like The Killing and The Bridge. Scandinavia was the big hot cultural place of the moment in the early 2000s. And that led to an awful lot of exposure for a lot of these writers, a lot of these producers and TV programs. But it also meant that publishers were looking for more of the same. And that is just the way publishing works. And so that was one of the reasons why Lindqvist maybe was able to become translated into English and then many other languages, because of what riding on the wave of this, even if he's not this kind of text. And that's obviously really positive, but it also works the way a lot of these things works, and it's kind of cyclical. So after a few years, people stopped looking towards Scandinavia, and then the publishing eyes maybe went towards Japan or South Korea, or a different area. So you kind of, it's almost if you can only be interested in one place for a short time, and then attention moves elsewhere. And that seems to have happened as well with a lot of Lindqvist academic criticism. In his first two books, there's quite a lot of focus on them, particularly his debut, because it was the breakthrough. It led to an incredibly popular film, which we'll talk about later. But then his most recent stuff seems to not really have hit into kind of academic circles. And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing, because a lot of us academics end up just talking to ourselves. But also it seems to point towards this idea that you have to write about the next newest best thing. And academia often follows publishing and that kind of popularity contest, because you want to do something that people will read, but also your attention is always being driven to the new thing. So I'm hoping that this isn't, I'm not going to change people the wave of academia with this, but I'm hoping to kind of reappraise Lindqvist, and I potentially, if I find time amongst all my other responsibilities and deadlines, may want to make this into a kind of introductory book to Lindqvist, where each chapter takes one of his novels and introduces it into a wider context. That's potentially where this will end up, but don't hold your breath, because I'm a part-time academic. These things take a long time. So Scandinavia here is this kind of weird cultural mishmash of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and all these kind of, it becomes this kind of unreal, uncanny, the North space. It's not necessarily linked to a particular individual nation. And so I deliberately draw attention to that, because I think Lindqvist is very much informed by Swedish context. And so to kind of lose him within this Nordic mishmash can lead you to not notice some of the kind of specific aspects of it, but it is clearly part of why he was originally brought to an English-speaking audience. So here is John Ajvide Lindqvist in his all his splendor in a very Scandinavian-looking wood cabin. He was born in 1956 in Blackeberg, which is a district of Stockholm and is the location of Let the Right One In, especially, and the kind of location of much of the other novels, even though they're not always specified exactly. They are. Before writing, he was a stand-up comedian, also a writer of TV comedy, and a stage magician, so it leads to lots of previews and authorial interviews where it's like the bringing the magic to horror and the horror magician and everything. So it's kind of definitely something that people hang on to. I think there's also a lot of clear parallels between comedy and horror, but also horror and magic in terms of hiding, revealing, at what point you show what you hide, what you don't show, and also just the kind of entertainment side of it. So I think there is definitely an overlap between those careers. This might seem like an odd thing to note, but it will come up a couple of times. He's very much a Morrissey and the Smiths fan, although I haven't seen him talk about Morrissey since Morrissey took his kind of lurch to the reactionary right. So I don't know if that's still the case. And I would actually be arguing as I go through this that Lindqvist books generally are kind of like the antidote to that kind of xenophobic, protectionist, anti-foreigner, anti-immigration rhetoric that Morrissey has so much embraced over recent years. And then finally, in terms of biography, because I don't tend to focus on biography, but this seems to be something that comes up and is relevant to some of his stories. He lost his father in a drowning accident. And so there's this kind of continual presence of water as a sinister aspect, some of which is, I think, linked to wider ideas of Swedish being a maritime trading nation. Think back to the Vikings and everything else. But I think some of it is perhaps more close to home. So water is this threatening other in lots of books for various reasons, which we'll find out as we go through. So that's the man. In terms of the wider context, we all know aspects of Swedish mythology, whether we do or not, because we have the days of the week in English, many of which are influenced by Swedish mythology, but also texts like the Norse sagas, Beowulf, and then individual creatures like the trolls and changelings, films like Troll and Troll Hunter. I think there's going to be a sequel to Troll, which I think is going to be imaginatively titled Troll 2, but not the one that's already come out that was Troll 2 and was very weird in the 80s. So there is this wider use of Scandinavian creatures, mythology, folk tales, which is there sometimes in the forefront and sometimes kind of there in the context of these tales. And I'm conscious with some of them that I'm, as we'll see certainly in discussion later with some of the texts, of not having a full awareness of that Swedish context as a non-Swede. So if anyone is Swedish or knows a Swedish person who would like to talk to me about this, I would really appreciate that. I will bend their ear about Lindqvist and sort of say, is this a good translation of this phrase? Is this something else? But the thing that's probably perhaps most useful to know, and I was not aware of before starting to really get into Lindqvist outside of just reading the books for fun, is that there is the constant presence of this kind of epochal changing moment in 1986 where Swedish Socialist Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated. And that is described by Wicmark as the still unresolved murder of Palme has gained a strong symbolic value for Swedes as an instant mark and a kind of end to innocence, and connected to the gradual dismantling of the Swedish welfare state. Is been referred to by media as the shot against the Swedish folkhem. And the folkhem was this kind of socialist movement in the 50s and 60s in Sweden that was all about a kind of wider welfare state, a more progressive, more caring approach to government and to society. And this has been looked back as a moment in which this seemed to be disintegrating from that point on, as if it was all embodied within the figure of Olof Palme. And so it becomes this lingering kind of haunting presence within the novels, sometimes explicitly mentioned, but sometimes kind of there in the background, as if there's kind of something lost, something rotten in the state of Sweden, to misquote some writer in some play called Hamlet or something. So in also continuing this idea of the very Swedish nature of Lindqvist, in 2022, he wrote an audio story called Kiln that can only be listened to inside Sweden's borders. It's geo-locked, I think, on Spotify and other audio programs, and it's supposed to accompany walks through the forests of Sweden. And I don't have the research budget to do that, unfortunately. There's probably a way in which I could ungeolock it, but I almost don't want to, because it feels like it would be a kind of betrayal of what that's about. And it wouldn't quite work if I was walking along Morecambe's Pier, which is a kind of uncanny, dangerously gothic space full of the sea and worry as well, but not quite the same as Lindqvist's work. So that's hopefully an idea of the context in which there. It's I'm not an expert on Swedish culture. If I do write the book, I'm obviously going to have to do a lot more work on this side. But I do think this particular factor is really useful in understanding something that underlies a lot of Lindqvist's work, something that is a kind of native horror culturally and socially in Sweden that Lindqvist is interrogating or working through in his horror fiction. So here we have the 8 novels published and translated into English. There is also a short story collection, which I'll talk about briefly. And we have 4 films, a TV series, a touring play, and then currently, I think, 4 more novels that are yet to be translated into English. That's a lot to talk about in 30 minutes. So I'm only going to focus on a couple of them and kind of briefly give you a synopsis of some of the others to make sure that I'm not keeping you all night, because I'm sure you have other things to do on a Saturday night other than listen to me. So we start with Let the Right One In, Let der Rätte komma in, from 2004, which was translated to English by Ebba Segerberg 3 years later. This was a huge publishing sensation in Sweden first, and then was popularized around the world after an amazing film adaptation, and then other visual treatments. So it became used for theatre plays. It was used just as this great moment of kind of Swedish cinema and Swedish horror cinema. And that's when I first my attention to Lindqvist first appeared. Wasn't the novel, but was the film. Back in the days of blogs and news groups, the horror world generally was raving about this Swedish film everyone should watch that completely changes the way you view vampires. And then it was only kind of later that the book came across in translation. Then suddenly it was like, okay, this is actually a really interesting writer who's got something different to say, and isn't just continuing that Anne Rice influenced tortured vampire as human scenario. They're just like us, but they drink blood. There's elements of that in Ellie being a tragic figure, but there's more depth and there's more understanding that also Ellie is a predatory figure, is an animal that eats blood, and so it should be feared in that way. The way the film, and particularly the film, but the novel as well, are often read is in terms of it being a love story between Ellie or Eli and Oscar. So Oscar is a disaffected 12-year-old who lives in a rundown council block. He's bullied. He wants to fight back, but doesn't have the power to do so. You first meet him in the film stabbing at a tree with a knife because he's pretending it's his bullies. But then he meets Eli, and suddenly he kind of finds a friend. And it's sort of seen as this moment where these disaffected, tragic figures find each other, and then Romeo and Juliet-esque kind of fight back against those that are against them. But it's much more complicated than that, and that Eli isn't a child. Eli constantly says, I am not a child, we can't be friends, because Eli is a vampire. Sorry if that's a spoiler. So Eli is eternally 12 years old. And it turns out in the novel in particular, we find out that Eli, despite looking like a girl, is a boy who was castrated at 12 as part of this weird blood ritual in front of this other vampire who then turns him. And so this kind of androgyny that is the key to the film, in the novel, it's given a lot more context and a lot more background, a lot more kind of historical detail, but also a lot more kind of traumatic detail, that we actually live through Eli's mutilation through a dream sequence that is shared with Oscar. So at the end of the novel, Oscar and Eli run away, and presumably in a happy way to flourish, and for them to find somewhere outside of the bullying and the darkness of the tenement where they began the relationship. but this is a 100-year-old vampire who kills for blood and a 12-year-old boy. So to read it as a love story, I think is it seems harsh to call it naive, but it's maybe too optimistic to read it in a way that takes away the horror of this, where is this actually just Oscar becoming another victim? Is he someone who's going to have to just go out and find victims for Eli in the same way that the previous thrall, Hakan, did? This next bit does refer to the threat of child sexual assault. So if that's something you don't need to listen to, then feel free to mute me for 2 or 3 minutes. And you'll quickly be able to see when I turn the slide that discussion is finished. So Hakan in the film is almost a kind of pathetically tragic figure who tries to commit murders to collect the blood for Eli, but fails every turn, and then is end up being caught, burns his face with acid to avoid him being tracked back to Eli, and then Eli kills him, throws him out the hospital window, and that's the last you see of him. In the novel, he comes back from the dead as this predatory paedophilic zombie with a permanent erection who wanders around, tracks down Eli, corners them in a basement, and then attempts to rape them. And it's this incredibly, disturbingly over-the-top, excessively graphic sequence that is far more splatterpunk than gothic, but also maybe points towards the way in which Lindqvist, is a comic writer, and that there is that kind of thin line between horror and comedy, and the idea of this zombie walking around with an erection is kind of funny, but then when it tries to be brought to bear on this 12-year-old / 100-year-old vampire, it becomes a different register. So it's this kind of weird tonal whiplash. And actually, this is one of those examples where I'd say the film is maybe better overall than the book, because it retains the tone throughout, and I think doesn't end up disappearing into this bizarre side story that you could completely skip and it wouldn't change the way the novel works. It's almost like very much a first novel phenomenon. Very different than moving on to Lindqvist's second novel, and what I consider probably to be his masterpiece, although I'm turning around to his most recent one, maybe taking that crown, apart from the fact it's so long, is Hanteringen of Odada, which is Handling the Undead. And this moves from the vampire of the first novel to the zombie, and what I call rethinking the zombie. So the zombie here isn't this shambling horde from beyond the grave that seeks blood or brains or the flesh of the living. It's actually much more melancholy and much more sentimental and much more humanizing. These zombies are just the returned dead into a community, and so the community has to work out how to coexist with the people they think they've left behind. And so that is much more in keeping with the French film Les Revenants, which was turned into a series called The Return on Netflix. I don't know if it's still available on Netflix. That thing with streaming services, often things disappear. But it is this kind of it's looking at the return of the dead, not about them being a threat, but about them being perhaps an inconvenience. Because part of learning to move on when we experience loss is learning to cope with there not being that person there. When they come back, what do we do? How do we work with those emotions, those practicalities? Simple things like it involves families who have redeveloped the room that somebody has left because they're no longer using it, and then they return. So do they get their room back? So it's this kind of odd idea that's much more to do with the culture of a community that can't move on, that can't become something else. And this begins with an epigraph from Morrissey. This is the first of our Morrissey references. All that we hope is when we go, our skin and our blood and our bones, they don't get in your way, making you ill the way they did when we lived. That's from There's a Place in Hell for Me and My Friends. So it is this idea that in returning from beyond, what does that mean for the community? What does that do to the people that are left? How do we accommodate those we thought we had left? And this happens through this bizarre supernatural electrical storm. Early in the evening, it simply felt like an approaching thunderstorm, but the electric tension in the air gradually, imperceptibly become more intense. The invisible field of electricity could not be touched, but it was there. Everyone could feel it. And this electrical field causes every electrical appliance in the town to remain switched on. It can't be turned off. So it's like a metaphor of rebooting, of something being unable to be turned off, unable to be powered down or shut down the way that people are. And then as part of this, these weird caterpillars, these white caterpillars appear, and a drunk who's in one of the cemeteries sees one of these shrinking, but then the caterpillar was not shrinking. It was just that less and less of it was visible because it was drilling down into the stone. So these caterpillars are like a manifestation of the soul. And one of my questions, I spoke this morning about it, and somebody put in the text that it sounded maybe more like a maggot, is I don't know how the translation here works, whether it's referring to something specifically Swedish about a notion of the soul as being this kind of physical manifestation. Obviously, the caterpillar works in terms of metamorphosis, the kind of blossoming out into a butterfly, etc. But there's something very larval about this, which speaks to this idea of the soul and of being reborn into the world. And then at the end of the novel, we see these white caterpillars reappearing. Elias was about to say something else, but his speech was becoming weaker as a white caterpillar broke free from his chest and a clump of darkness reached out from where it was seated. Anna cupped her hand around the caterpillar and picked it up, holding it there for a couple of seconds. I will think of you always. Then she let him go. So hopefully you can kind of see the way in which these two texts, Let the Right One In and Let Him Go at the end of this novel, are about acceptance, what you bring in, what you let go, about hospitality, but also about how the self is formed in interaction with what might be classed as monsters, but are often more human than that. And that very kind of common horror trope of where is the monster, where is the man, and the kind of the blurring the lines between that is very much at the heart of Lindqvist's writing. This is a shot from the film, which I've not been able to watch fully because the version I bought ended up being a Chinese knockoff, so it has no English subtitles. And it's a Norwegian film of a Swedish novel with Chinese subtitles, so I'm struggling to follow it. But it's beautifully shot and really kind of captures that downbeat, melancholic vibe, and shows, though, in which these zombies are kind of cipher for society. So a group of young drunk men go out into the place where the undead are being congregated and attack them because they've been brought up with zombie films, with Resident Evil, to see them as objects to be defeated, but they don't fight back, the zombies, the undead, because they are just undead shells. They aren't this threatening side. But then when they are attacked, one of them does bite in self-defense, and then we don't find out the fate of the person who's bitten. It doesn't become that kind of a zombie story. But the zombies are very much a thing on which society is imposed. They're not the real point of it. The point of it is the way in which the families envisage their lives with the people they thought they had lost being back in them. Is that a positive? Can you go back after you've grieved to accept that person still remains? As I said, I think it's Lindqvist's masterpiece. I would recommend people read that. It's an amazing book. It still holds up now, and hopefully the film will be more available relatively soon. It was only made last year, so I think it's still in that kind of festival round process. So a couple of books we'll skim through now. The next book was Manistoham, which is translated as Harbour, by Marlene Delage, who then went on to translate all of the rest of Lindqvist's books so far, which is somewhat Lovecraftian, that it's set on this island surrounded by the sea. Father loses his daughter, and it's his quest to find her again. We don't know if that's real, whether it's a kind of a passage of the soul, whether it's an actual quest. At the end of the book, it's really ambiguous as to whether anything has been resolved or whether it's just somebody's descent into a kind of grief-induced madness. You can obviously see this continuing idea of the family. And as Whitemark talks about in a brilliant essay on ecology in Lindqvist Handling the Undead, with reference to his other books, it really builds on this idea of humanity being a destructive force while the monstrous creatures are ambiguous heroes. But in this, the monstrous entity is the ocean. It's the threat of the sea. It's the fact that it's somewhere you can go, be swallowed up, and never return. There is also, and this is the final explicit mention of Morrissey, which may be a relief to some of you, there are two bizarre ghosts inhabiting this island who go around on a moped and speak only in quotes from the Smiths lyrics. And so I never quite know whether this is entirely self-indulgent on Lindqvist's part, whether there's something deeper going on there. And if I do go on to write this into a book, then I will obviously really have to indulge myself in listening to all the Smiths records and kind of working out what's going on there. But it is particularly stands out. There is also one of the most disturbing scenes based around a toilet this side of Train Spotting, and was the source of a paper I've never yet given on toilets in Gothic fiction, which I've never quite found the right avenue for. I'm not sure if Sam would want that here or not, but maybe. The subtitle for that is Shitty Gothic, which gives a different kind of movement to it. So not quite so safe for work on social media. Harbour was followed up by Lille Stjerne, translated Little Star, which is a very, what seems a very Swedish tale of a changeling child. So a child who's found in the woods with this beautiful voice, found by these aging songwriters who, once they hear this ethereal tone, this beautiful sound, this beautiful music, they look after her, keep her within their kind of woodland hut, use her as inspiration to write some songs. She then, when she turns 12 or 13, dismembers them to find where love exists within them. So again, this idea of the kind of the monster being looking for questions, and very Frankensteinian. Where is love? Where is language? Where is culture? And then is thrust into the modern world of music culture, and becomes a star, but is then caught up in the corruption, the abuse, the exploitation of talent shows and the music industry, before finally finding a group of disaffected girls, all in their teens, through kind of online news groups and things, who form this cult called the Wolves of Skansen. And they go on to murder over 30 concert goers. This big ending, which I've spoke this morning as well about, is very reminiscent of the end of Carrie. There seems to be this kind of definite end in this social event before Teres, who is this nightmare child, and her counterpart, Teresa, the poet, escape into an enclosure of actual wolves. So you don't know whether they just become wolves, become accepted by the wolves, or just get caught later on. It's a really interesting novel, but it's much more to do with real world issues. And I find the ending difficult to really get my head around just quite where it fits in. It feels like a little bit of an outlier, although there is something there clearly about who you let into your community and why you do as well. And then, as a quick look back, following these novels, we have the translation of Pappersväggar, or Paper Walls, which was the short story collection by Lindqvist. And the most notable of these stories is Border, which was turned into an amazing award-winning film, which is all about a troll who works as a security agent in an airport, because they have an innate capacity to detect lies. But again, it's this idea of who you let in, who you don't. But also, there are two mini sequels, which I will argue, neither of which are really particularly necessary, and both almost kind of undermine the original novels to some degree. So Let the Old Dreams Die, which is what it was translated, the title in the English translation, see some minor characters from Let the Right One In, look back on what happened, and navigate their own mortality, which is the good part. But at the end, you get this revelation that Oscar and Eli are active in Barcelona 25 years later, but still looking the same 12-year-old child on both cases. So it seems to retcon that Oscar is now a vampire as well, rather than being the new thrall, which is what the novel entirely leads towards. So it seems like a deliberate decision to kind of retcon what people wanted from the novel, but not what I think is actually in the novel. But Lindqvist wrote them, so he can obviously do that. I just don't think it necessarily adds an awful lot. And then the final processing is the kind of mini sequel to Handling the Undead, and follows a very kind of straightforward, stereotypical notion where you have the undead kept within this place called the Heath, and it's all about secret government experiments on them to work out why they don't die, and other ways of using them as subjects of experiments that have no rights and no kind of legal backing, which is fine, but it's been there, done that. It doesn't feel like it really adds to it because the original novel is so focused on individuals and community without this over kind of scientific approach that's there in the short story. So again, there is a really good book. There's some really good stories in there. But the two that really sold it, I think, don't necessarily add much to the original novels. So for those of you that are attending the book group, I Will Always Find You, which is the second in the Platserna trilogy. They are good. I really enjoyed them, but I don't have a lot to say about them in this talk because they are kind of more like supernaturally influenced procedural police work rather than kind of horror in a strict sense. There is some horrific moments in them that could be teased out, but I've only got so much time. So by all means, you should read them. They are good. They don't necessarily fit in here today. Which leaves us with the most recent of Lindqvist's books, which I think is the only thing that's stopping it from me thinking it's his masterpiece, if it's focusing on the camera, is it's over 900 pages long, which is an investment of time, which many of us don't have anymore. But also because of that, it does suffer from that kind of Stephen King level of bloat at some place. You do feel some of it could have been edited down. A lot of that is devoted to really important stories between this group of, again, disaffected characters, but they are young adults now rather than teenagers who find each other through the social networking of Pokemon Go, which again dates it to some degree to a very much of this moment. But you have the same kind of mismatch of people who are upset with the local council because they were let down as children by the social workers. You have two individuals who are united because they have this strange second sight where they can foresee or hear tragedy is about to happen, but only in a very short space of time. So they have to try and work a way to use that to some kind of benefit, and other kind of disaffected characters. So it's very much similar to the gang of teenagers in Stephen King's It. So it is a group that come together in the face of a existential horror, and they it's all in one time scale now, so we don't have that kind of separation when they come back as adults as we do in It, but it is a very similar idea that in joining together and turning against their differences, they create a unity which fights back against this threat and this other. So it's clearly influenced by the likes of It, but it also doesn't fall into the extremely over-the-top alien mystery of It. This isn't some demonic alien spider. This is very much a threat that comes from reality. And to give you the blurb, and I'm going to read out a couple of excerpts from the book as part of this, because I think the language here and what it's talking about is really, really powerful, rather than me just giving you the kind of the synopsis of the kind of led up to this. So the blurb says, a yellow shipping container is mysteriously dumped in the small Swedish port town of Norrtälje. No one knows how it got there or what it holds. Due to the municipal authority's ignorance of its ownership, it isn't until a week has passed before it is forced open. There unfolds a situation of unrelenting horror. The remains of 28 refugees are found. Not only that, a black sludge pours out which contaminates the river and is the cause of a new sickening dread that affects Norrtälje's inhabitants, causing a lack of trust, aggression, intolerance, violence. It seems like an end to kindness. So again, we have this motif of water, we have this motif of something being let into a society, but here, rather than this centuries-old monster that was created by another centuries-old vampire, rather than this freak electronic storm bring back the death, what we have is a horror that's brought about by xenophobia, by anti-immigration rhetoric, by the media, by the right wing, by whatever we want to describe it, but it's about a real horror, a real sickness in society that is given this kind of reality that changes the reality of everyone in Norrtälje. It feeds into the water. Everyone that drinks the water starts becoming less tolerant, less kind. And that starts off with just people not saying thank you, people not being polite, not stopping to let other people walk in front of them in the street, and then eventually turns into the potential for real tragedy and people being killed, anti-immigrant sentiment, but also anti-immigrant riots and all these kind of things that uncannily echo what has happened in Sweden, in the UK, in America, all around the world, it seems, with this constant contemporary way of monstrosizing and dehumanizing some of the most vulnerable people in society. So it's all about that part. So the monsters that are created create the monsters of the people's intolerance as well in turn. So throughout the novel, we have an interspersing of moments that are taking place within the container. So they're flashbacks to what was happening inside this hellish environment, this small shipping container filled with 28 abused and exploited asylum seekers who thought they were getting a path to somewhere better, but were just left to die, partly due to the evils of human trafficking, but also partly due to the bureaucracy of the local council, who didn't know who this shipping container was owned by, so didn't think to open it. So the idea is, did they die before, or did they die when they were on Swedish soils? So in one of the first sections, we have the unnamed figure inside the shipping container. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that we are not alone. There is something here apart from the 28 people who were shot in this container 4 days ago. I don't know what it is, but I do know what effect it's having. It happened a few hours ago. I was sitting as usual, my back against the wall of the container, my knees drawn up, arms by my sides, backs of my hands on the floor. There is no difference in here between sleeping and being awake, but I think I nodded off and was woken by a movement. The container had tilted in my direction, which meant the sludge was now covering my palms. I was about to raise them when I felt it, the movement, a wet, jelly-like caress on my left palm, like a jellyfish passing by. It's hard to describe, and of course, I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I can state with absolute certainty it was something living. So rather than just this metaphysical idea of unkindness and hatred, it's manifested into this actual thing that lives inside the container and then is released into the water. And in what is perhaps one of the darkest passages in this or any other novel, but a far more mature darkness, rather than the gratuitous darkness of the moment from the moment I talked about with Lindqvist's debut, which is darkly humorous but over the top and splatterpunky. You have a kind of gut-wrenching tragedy as we hear the final entry by this unnamed inhabitant of the shipping container. My wife is dead. My daughter is dead. I killed them with my own hands. When they were sleeping or in a state of semi-consciousness, I pinched their noses and covered their mouths one at a time. First my daughter, then my wife. They struggled only briefly before sinking down into the sludge. They didn't have the strength to fight back, or maybe it was what they wanted. I did it to spare them a worse fate. Then I tried to kill myself by banging my head as hard as I could against the wall of the container. I was out for a long time. Then I came back, I think. For the past 2 days, I've considered the possibility that I'm already dead, that this is what death is like. So the horror here is incredibly raw, incredibly real. It's a horror that we can identify as existing in the real world. And this seems like a natural path on which Lindqvist has been writing since his very first novel, where by humanizing the monster and monstrifying the humans, it draws attention to the thin lines between all of them, which is what a lot of good horror does. I'm all for horror that is just over the top creature features with splattering gore, but the best horror, I think, has something ethical to say, which is where we can kind of return back to the bookended Derrida quote. And by letting us say yes to who or what turns up, by letting the right one in and by letting whoever in, hopefully that can hold off some of the horror and monstrosity that our modern culture summons up in the aid or in the name of national borders, in the name of patriotism, in the name of xenophobia. So yeah, I think it's a really important, a really ethically valuable and vital book that I would recommend people going out to read. I think it's really good. It also has a train of optimism running through it, despite this. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but there is more to be said. It's not just this. It's not doom scrolling in the way that we do if we're on social media or reading newspapers or watching the news. It's positing something else, that actually community can lead to a path past the horror. So that is kind of the outline of the thing. I don't leave on that point because that's quite a down point to leave the talk, but that is the kind of the end of the thesis part of it. But to highlight some of the things that are carrying on with Lindqvist, if you don't have the time to read the books, and not everyone, even in these kind of groups, is all about reading, there are four films of Lindqvist works which are all very good. The original Swedish film, as I've said earlier, is probably better than the book. It's much more tonally consistent. The American remake is often shot for shot, so is kind of unneeded, but does have some interesting aspects in terms of relocating transculturally towards a 1980s Reagan-inspired America, and starts off with his Axis of Evil speech, so he's kind of really picking into a different kind of cultural poetics. Border is an amazingly beautiful and fantastic film, freely available on DVD and Blu-ray. It's not on Mubi anymore, despite having it on the box there, because Mubi rotate their collection too often to keep up with. And then Handling the Undead was released last year, and as I said, I've got a version that I thought was legitimate, but I can't watch and follow. But hopefully that will be finding its round properly into English soon. There has also been a TV show of Let the Right One In, which was cancelled after one season. And that didn't really follow the story at all, because it's all about a loving father whose 10-year-old daughter is a vampire. So it takes that kind of full circle away from that threatening, paedophilic idea of Hakan the thrall to actually being just a good dad. And, you know, we like good dads. Good dads are a good thing. But it isn't really what the book was about. It seems to kind of relocate it into something that's more like The Last of Us or something else. And then there is a touring production of Let the Right One In, the stage show, which somebody earlier this morning said is actually touring again. So I'm now going to check that out to see if I can go and see it if possible. And as I said, I don't speak Swedish. A lot of my research for this is done via Google Translate, which is its own kind of monster, creating its own kind of weird fictions. But there are now 4 books that are published in Swedish waiting to be translated. Verklighten is all about a kind of Truman Show-esque horror where somebody sees through the folds and realizes their reality does not exist. So it plays on reality TV, but also a kind of potentially Cthulhu-esque horror. But again, I only have the blurb translated to know. And then the Bloodstormen trilogy looks like it's kind of back to being more kind of procedural. But again, I don't know for sure. So hopefully these will be finding their way across soon. And maybe if that's the case, Sam can set the second or third one for a future reading group, because that is very much Sam's way of being. So that is the talk. Thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully that was a little bit more polished this morning. We'll see. So hopefully anyone got any questions or comments, I'm be grateful to hear them. And if anyone knows anyone Swedish who can help me out, then I will buy you a pint or a coffee or something else.